The call came into the Clearwater, Florida police station around 3 p.m. on a sweltering Thursday in August. A woman was having an emotional breakdown inside a second-floor apartment in a run-down residential complex on the outskirts of town. Neighbors reported screams, objects being thrown against the walls, and what appeared to be someone in deep psychological distress. The dispatcher assigned the call to Officer Melissa Garrett, a 28-year-old police officer with 5 years of experience on the force and a reputation for being particularly effective in situations involving mental health crises. Melissa parked the patrol car in front of the weathered building, its stucco walls peeling under the relentless Florida sun. She adjusted the body camera strapped to her uniform, quickly checking that the red recording light was on. It was standard procedure for all interactions, but Melissa always double-checked when responding to calls involving emotional distress. These situations could unfold in unpredictable ways, and having everything recorded protected both her and the people involved. Climbing the outside stairs, covered in a thin layer of sand carried by the wind, Melissa could hear the sobs even before reaching the second-floor hallway. They were the kind of sobs that come from deep within, that guttural sound that suggests something far beyond a simple bad day. The door to apartment 207 was ajar, swaying slightly with each burst of air conditioning that escaped from inside. Melissa knocked gently on the doorframe before pushing it open a little further. "Police department, may I come in?" Her voice was firm but not threatening, the tone carefully calibrated after years of training and field experience. No one answered, but the sobs continued, now accompanied by gasping breaths that suggested a panic attack in full swing. The officer entered slowly, keeping one hand near the radio strapped to her shoulder and the other relaxed at her side. The apartment was small and dark, with heavy curtains blocking most of the daylight. Cheap furniture was scattered in odd positions, as if it had been hastily moved or jostled during a moment of agitation. A chair lay overturned near the dining table, and shards of glass from a broken cup glistened on the kitchen floor. Melissa found the woman in the corner of the living room, huddled between the sofa and the wall. She was wearing an olive green tank top and grey sweatpants, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her hands covered her face, and her whole body trembled with the intensity of her sobs. The scene was one of pure despair, the kind of image that would make even experienced police officers feel a pang in their chest. "Hey, it's okay. Everything's all right now." Melissa crouched down slowly, keeping enough distance not to invade the woman's personal space, but close enough that her presence was comforting. "My name is Melissa. I'm a police officer, but I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" The woman lowered her hands just enough to reveal red, swollen eyes. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken between sobs. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, it's okay. Take a deep breath with me, all right? Inhale through your nose, hold for 3 seconds, then exhale through your mouth. Melissa demonstrated the breathing technique, exaggerating the movement so Sarah could follow. It was a basic de-escalation strategy, but often effective in interrupting the hyperventilation cycle that accompanied severe panic attacks. Sarah tried to keep up, her breathing still irregular but gradually stabilizing. It took several minutes before she could form complete sentences. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't cause any trouble. Sometimes life gets too heavy and we need help. There's no shame in that." Melissa maintained a calm and even tone of voice, without judgment. She had learned early in her career that people in crisis didn't need someone analyzing or questioning their feelings, just someone who recognized their pain as valid. For the next 15 minutes, Melissa worked patiently to bring Sarah back to a state of relative calm. She asked simple questions about the apartment, commented on a well-tended plant in the window, and inquired if Sarah had any water to drink. These were banal and intentionally superficial conversations, designed to anchor the woman in the present and pull her away from whatever mental abyss she had fallen into. Sarah explained, between sips of water, that she'd had a particularly difficult day at work, that she felt overwhelmed by financial problems, and that she was dealing with the recent end of a relationship. These were common challenges, the kind of perfect storm of stresses that could bring anyone down. Melissa listened with genuine attention, nodding at appropriate moments, offering words of validation without trying to minimize Sarah's, suffering with empty platitudes about how everything would be all right. Do you have someone who can stay with you today? Family? Friends? Melissa asked eventually. It was important to ensure that Sarah wasn't alone for the next few hours, when she was still vulnerable. Sarah shook her head negatively. My family lives in another state, and my friends, I don't know. I don't want to bother anyone with this. You wouldn't be a bother, but I understand. Melissa sat on the floor next to Sarah, crossing her legs in a way that suggested she wasn't in a hurry to leave. How about I stay here a little longer? We can talk about resources that might help. I know some really good support lines, and there's a community mental health center a few blocks from here that has flexible hours. Sarah seemed relieved by the offer. Would you do that? Of course. It's literally part of my job to make sure you're safe. Melissa smiled genuinely, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw Sarah flash something close to a smile as well. It was during this moment of relative tranquility that Melissa decided to run a routine check on the system. It was standard procedure for any service call to collect basic information for the report, including confirming the identity of the person involved and checking for any outstanding warrants or other alerts in the system. She picked up the handheld radio and pressed the side button. Central. This is Garrett. I need a background check for Sarah Mitchell. Can you spell the last name for me, Sarah? Sarah spelled it out slowly, and Melissa repeated the information over the radio along with the birth date Sarah had provided. There was a protocol for these checks that happened thousands of times a day in police departments across the country. A dispatcher in the communications center would type the name into multiple state and national databases, searching for any relevant information that officers in the field needed to know. The reply came perhaps 2 minutes later. Garrett, the central office confirms a record for a Mitchell under that last name and date of birth, but the first name on file appears as Marcus, not Sarah. Are you dealing with the right person there? Melissa frowned slightly, looking at Sarah with a questioning expression. Registration errors happened, but they were usually spelling issues, not completely different names. Sarah, is there any chance you have another name in the system? Maybe a birth name or something you don't use anymore? The change in Sarah was instantaneous and dramatic. All the calm that Melissa had patiently built up over the past 20 minutes evaporated in a second. Sarah's face paled, her eyes widened with something that went far beyond anxiety and firmly entered the territory of pure terror. She began to tremble again, but this time not from crying, but from something more visceral, more primal. Marcus! Sarah whispered the word as if it were a curse or a ghost she thought she had buried. Her hands instinctively went to her throat, and she began to move away from Melissa, dragging herself across the floor until her back hit the opposite wall. Hey, calm down. Everything's okay. Melissa raised her hands in a universal gesture of peace, completely confused by the extreme reaction. Sarah, you're safe here. I just need to understand what's happening. Can we talk about it? But Sarah was beyond the reach of reassuring words now. She shook her head violently from side to side, her eyes wide and glazed in a way Melissa recognized as severe dissociation. He's dead. Marcus is dead. I killed him. I had to kill him. The words came out in an almost incoherent torrent, but Melissa caught them clearly enough to feel a chill run down her spine. Her hand instinctively went to the radio again, but she forced herself to remain calm. People in crisis said things that weren't literal all the time, expressions of inner turmoil that shouldn't be, interpreted as confessions of actual crimes. Sarah, listen to my voice. You're having a panic attack. Nothing bad is going to happen here, but I need you to breathe and talk to me. Melissa kept her hands visible, her body language deliberately non-threatening. You don't understand. Sarah practically shouted the words. "Marcus Mitchell, that was me. That was who I used to be before all this, before I finally managed to get rid of him. But he's still there in the system. He still exists in the computers and the files, and I can't stand him being there. He should be dead." Understanding began to slowly dawn on Melissa. The different name in the system, the extreme reaction, the words about death that weren't literal but metaphorical. Sarah was a trans woman, and Marcus was her pre-transition name, what many people in the LGBTQ community called a dead name. And seeing that name appear in the police system had triggered a severe psychological crisis. Melissa felt her heart clench with a mixture of compassion and embarrassment. She had received some training on LGBTQ sensitivity at the police academy, but it was the kind of rushed 2-hour module that barely scratched the surface of complex issues. Now she was facing a real situation where that inadequate training left huge gaps in her ability to respond appropriately. "Sarah, listen. I understand now. The name in the system is no longer who you are." Melissa chose her words carefully, desperate not to make the situation worse. "And we can work to change that. There are legal processes, lawsuits." Sarah laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think I don't know about lawsuits? It took me 2 years and thousands of dollars. I didn't have to legally change my name. I changed my driver's license, my social security card, my birth certificate. I did everything. But I still show up in some police database as Marcus. I'm still treated as him in their systems, as if those last 5 years of my life didn't count for anything." Sarah's voice broke again, but this time there was anger mixed with despair. It was the anger of someone who had fought an exhausting battle for recognition and dignity, only to discover that there was yet another locked door, yet another system that refused to see her for who she truly was. Melissa felt the weight of the inadequacy of the system she represented. How often did this happen? How many trans people across the country face this additional humiliation? When interacting with the police, having their dead names unearthed from outdated databases like accusing ghosts. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. Genuinely, this shouldn't happen." "But it happens. It always happens." Sarah was crying again now, but these were tears of exhaustion instead of panic. "Every time I interact with any part of the government, every time I go through a background check for a job, every time the police check my name for any reason, there he is, Marcus. Like a ghost that refuses to leave me alone, like a version of myself that I fought so hard to leave behind, but that everyone insists on keeping alive." The officer remained silent for a long moment, processing not only Sarah's words, but the larger system they represented. She thought of all the forms she regularly filled out, all the checkboxes, all the mandatory fields in police databases: name, sex, date of birth, social security number. These were categories treated as immutable, set in stone, when the reality of human lives was infinitely more fluid and complex. "I'll see what I can do to add a note to the file," Melissa said eventually, knowing even as she spoke that it was an inadequate solution to a systemic problem. "I can't change the entire system, but I can ensure that your correct name is prominently displayed in any report I write today." Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Why are you being nice to me? Most of the police officers I know, they're not exactly known for being allies of the trans community." It was a fair observation, and Melissa couldn't honestly dispute it. She knew colleagues who made cruel jokes about trans people, who deliberately used the wrong pronouns, who saw the whole issue as a kind of indulgent farce rather than a profound reality of human existence. Not all of us are the same, and even if I don't fully understand everything about your experience, that doesn't mean you don't deserve basic respect and dignity. They sat on the floor of that dark apartment for another 15 minutes, the conversation eventually shifting away from the immediate crisis and into more neutral territory. Sarah talked about her job at an art supply store, about how she loved working with colors and textures, about a painting project she had started but hadn't been able to finish for weeks because of her depression. Melissa shared little about herself, keeping appropriate professional boundaries, but the simple act of listening seemed to help. Eventually, Sarah felt stable enough for Melissa to consider ending the call, but there was still the practical question of how to process this encounter in the system. Every police contact required documentation, a paper or electronic trail justifying how time and resources had been spent. Melissa knew that as soon as she typed her report, she would have to navigate through the same problematic database that had caused this whole crisis in the first place. "Sarah, I'll need to write a report about today. It's standard procedure, but I want you to know that I'll use your correct name everywhere I can, and I'll include notes about the database situation, so that if another officer responds to a call here in the future, they'll be aware." Sarah nodded slowly. "That would mean a lot. Thank you." Before leaving, Melissa made sure Sarah had numbers for crisis helplines, including specifically the Trans Lifeline, a support service run by and for transgender people. She also double-checked that Sarah did not have active suicidal thoughts, asking the difficult but necessary questions that could mean the difference between appropriate intervention and tragedy. Descending the stairs back to the patrol car, Melissa felt the emotional weight of the encounter settling on her shoulders. It was the kind of call that would stay with her, that would make her question not only specific procedures, but the broader systems within which she operated. She got into the patrol car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, organizing her thoughts before driving back to the precinct. The report took longer to write than most. Melissa was meticulous about the details, ensuring that Sarah's name appeared prominently and consistently throughout the document. In the narrative section, she included a detailed explanation of the name discrepancy in the system and recommended that records be updated to reflect Sarah's current legal identity. It was a small act of advocacy within a massive bureaucracy, but it seemed important to make the effort. In the days following the incident, Melissa couldn't completely get Sarah out of her head. She found herself thinking about how many other trans people in Clearwater or throughout Florida faced similar challenges. How many encounters with the police were unnecessarily traumatized because outdated systems refused to recognize current identities. How many trans people avoided seeking help when they needed it precisely because they feared this kind of humiliation. She casually mentioned the incident to some colleagues during a coffee break, testing the waters to see how others would respond. The reactions were mixed. Some officers seemed genuinely interested and asked thoughtful questions about how best to handle similar situations in the future. Others shrugged or made dismissive comments that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about how many in law enforcement viewed transgender people. An older sergeant named Davis offered a perspective that resonated with Melissa. "Our databases are a mess, I'll tell you. They were built decades ago when nobody thought about this sort of thing. And now we're stuck trying to make old systems fit modern understandings of human identity. It's not an excuse, but it's reality." "So what do we do about it?" Melissa asked, frustration bleeding in her voice. Davis sighed, a deep exhalation carrying years of bureaucratic exhaustion. "We do what you did. We document the problem. We make enough noise that eventually the higher-ups pay attention. We treat the people in front of us with respect, even when the systems fail. Change in police departments happens at glacial speed, but it happens." Melissa appreciated the honesty, even if the proposed timeline was disheartening. Meanwhile, how many people would suffer? How many Sarahs would have psychological breakdowns because something as basic as their name wasn't respected? 3 weeks after the original encounter, Melissa was patrolling the same area when she decided to check on Sarah. It wasn't strictly necessary. There was no longer an active call or legal concern, but she was curious about how Sarah was recovering. She knocked on the door of apartment 207, half expecting not to get an answer. Sarah opened the door, and Melissa was surprised by the transformation. The woman before her looked rested, her hair neatly styled, wearing clean, pressed clothes instead of the crumpled sweatshirt from weeks ago. Most Significantly, Sarah was smiling, a genuine expression of warmth that hadn't been present during their first meeting. "Officer Garrett, I didn't expect to see you again. I was in the area and thought I'd pass by, if it's not a bad time." No, come in." Sarah opened the door wider, and Melissa entered the apartment, which was now organized and well lit, a stark contrast to the dark and chaotic space of weeks ago. They talked for maybe 15 minutes. Sarah explained that she had finally made an appointment with a therapist at the community mental health center that Melissa had recommended. She had started medication for depression and anxiety, and although she was still adjusting the dosages, she was already noticing a difference. More importantly, she had connected with a local support group for transgender people, finding community and solidarity that had been desperately lacking in her life. "What you said about making noise about the database situation," Sarah mentioned as they walked to the door. "I decided to take this seriously. I contacted some LGBTQ advocacy groups. Apparently, this is a problem in many states, not just Florida. There are people working on legislation that would require government records to be updated more quickly when names are legally changed." Melissa smiled. "That's great, Sarah. Really. Thank you for not giving up on me that day. You could have just taken me for an involuntary psychiatric evaluation or treated the whole situation as a nuisance. But you didn't. You stayed and listened." "It's literally the least you deserved," Melissa replied, but she knew it wasn't quite true. In many other scenarios, with many other officers, the call might have been handled very differently. Luck, good or bad, played an uncomfortably large role in determining how people in crisis were treated by the system. Driving back to the precinct, Melissa reflected on the limitations and responsibilities of her role. She was just an officer in a mid-sized police force in a Florida city. She couldn't rewrite state policies on databases, couldn't force systemic reforms, couldn't guarantee that every transgender person in her jurisdiction would be treated with dignity during police encounters. But she could control her own actions. She could choose to see the people in front of her as complex human beings instead of just data entries in a system. She could make the extra effort to use correct names and pronouns, to add contextual notes to reports, to treat each interaction as an opportunity to do the right thing even when the surrounding systems failed. Months later, Melissa would participate in an expanded training workshop on LGBTQ issues that her department finally implemented after pressure from local community groups. The workshop was more comprehensive than the quick module from her days in academia, delving deeply into how to appropriately respond to transgender people in crisis, how to navigate identity issues in official documentation, and how to recognize and combat implicit biases. During a breakout session, the facilitator asked participants to share relevant experiences. Melissa hesitated for a moment before telling Sarah's story, changing identifying details to protect privacy, but retaining the essence of the encounter and the lessons she had learned. Another officer in the group, an older man named Rodriguez, nodded in recognition. "I had something similar happen about a year ago. A trans guy in a routine traffic stop, and his current male name didn't match what appeared on my driver's license. I didn't know how to handle it, so I just proceeded with the stop and let him go. But I thought about it for weeks afterward, wondering if I should have done something differently." The discussion that followed was surprisingly open and honest. The officers shared their insecurities about how to navigate these situations, admitted gaps in their knowledge, and asked questions they might have been afraid to ask in other settings. It wasn't without awkward moments or occasional comments that revealed deep misunderstandings, but it was a start. The facilitator emphasized something that resonated deeply with Melissa. You don't need to fully understand someone's experience to treat them with basic dignity. Trans people aren't asking you to understand every nuance of gender dysphoria or to become an expert in queer theory. They're asking to be called by their correct names and treated as the whole. Human beings they are. It was a simple truth, yet somehow profound. Compassion didn't require complete mastery of academic vocabulary or encyclopedic knowledge of every possible identity. It only required a willingness to see people as they saw themselves, to respect their self-determination, and to not let bureaucratic systems triumph over individual humanity. Sarah continued her advocacy, becoming increasingly involved in legislative efforts to modernize how government records handled name and gender changes. She testified before state panels, sharing her story, including her encounter with Melissa, as an example of both the problem and the potential for positive change. Melissa never sought recognition for the role she played that August day. For her, it had simply been doing her job correctly, although she recognized that systemic failures meant that correctly wasn't always the norm. But when she occasionally saw Sarah at community events or their paths crossed somewhere in town, the exchange of nods and smiles carried a weight and meaning that went far beyond simple casual recognition. Years later, when the Clearwater Police database finally implemented an improved system that allowed for easier updating of identity information and prominently displayed correct names, even when old names were retained for historical record purposes, it would be in part because of the seeds planted by that single encounter in a dark apartment. But on that particular day in August, none of that was predictable. There was just a woman in crisis, an officer trying to help, and system failures that hadn't kept pace with our evolving understanding, the notion of who people could be. And in the narrow space between recognition and change, between individual compassion and institutional reform, human lives hung in the balance, waiting to see if they would be seen, recognized, and honored for who they truly were.